there is one place on this planet that is possibly the most special, the most unique, and the most otherworldly. Certainly, I've always felt so in natural history documentaries since I was a little boy. And so that place is Antarctica. And so today we are joined by Andrew Corso, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how biodiversity in Antarctica is sampled, how we get out there, what's going on, and what is out there to find to begin with. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Andrew, and take us away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jesse. I am very excited to be speaking to you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect. The moment it's up, I'll let you know, and we're all good to go. I've been waiting for this presentation all day, I must say. This is pretty exciting stuff. Oh, almost got it up. Perfect. Take us away, man.
Okay. All right. So again, thank you all for tuning in tonight. You know, I know there's so many interesting talks going on with the Global Biodiversity Festival, and I'm very excited that you decided to come and learn a little bit about Antarctic biodiversity. So as Jesse said, I am a marine scientist, so I want to use some of my experiences working in Antarctica to highlight a few unique examples of Antarctic biodiversity, how we sample this biodiversity, so some of the tools that we use to collect it, and also highlight how it's changing and how climate change might be impacting it and human travel as well. So a little bit more about myself. Again, my name is Andrew Corso, and I'm a PhD student at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science in the United States. And I'm part of this big collaborative group of scientists called the Palmer Antarctica Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And all these scientists have been going down to the same spot in Antarctica since 1993, studying a vast array of different biological and physical processes. So in addition to my work, which is on Antarctic fishes, I've had the wonderful opportunity to learn from all these other scientists that are studying everything from penguins to whales to ice. And again, that is what I'd like to speak with you today. Before we get to the biodiversity, I wanted to tell you just a little bit more about the place, a little bit more about Antarctica, because it's really cool. This is the continent of Antarctica pictured here, bottom of the world, South Pole, as I'm sure most of you are aware. You can see South America over here on the left. And surrounding the continent of Antarctica is the Southern Ocean, which is the only ocean that runs uninterrupted by any continental landmass. So you have this really, really powerful current that runs around the continent. It's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and it's the strongest oceanic current on the world. And this current isolates the continent and prevents a lot of warm water from getting in there, and it's one of the reasons why Antarctica is so cold. This current also makes the ocean conditions very rough in parts of the Southern Ocean. So to get to Antarctica, marine scientists often take ships. So this video on the right is us on a ship crossing this Drake Passage, which is notoriously the roughest ocean in the world, to get from the very tip of South America to the portion of Antarctica that I work in, which is the Western Antarctic Peninsula, or the WAP. So that's this area pictured down here. And all the organisms that I'm talking about today are found in this part of Antarctica. Okay, so one more thing before we get to biodiversity is I'm going to be talking a lot about climate change. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of Antarctic climate change. Antarctic climate change is very complex. There's a lot of different things going on in different places. So I'm going to specifically highlight what's happening in the Western Antarctic Peninsula region. So first up is that sea ice is declining. So in this region of Antarctica, sea ice grows and shrinks every year, and the amount of days each year with sea ice coverage are recorded as sea ice duration. So since the 1980s, that sea ice duration has decreased by about 3 months. So another way to think about that is since the 1980s, in this part of Antarctica, there's about 90 days less of sea ice coverage. So you can imagine this has huge impacts on some of the organisms that live down there that rely on sea ice. And in addition to that, temperatures are warming. So air temperatures are warming, but what this image is showing here is that ocean temperatures are warming as well. So there's a lot going on here, but what I just want you to focus on is you can see this red shaded area is where the ocean temperatures have warmed by at least 1 degree Celsius since the 1950s. And 1 degree Celsius might not seem like that much to you or me, but to marine organisms that have developed in this really cold environment, this is a huge change. So what our job is as scientists is to try and figure out how this change is impacting the Antarctic ecosystem and Antarctic biodiversity. So again, that's what I want to share with you today are a few examples of this biodiversity. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to talk about every bit of it with you. So I'm just going to highlight some of my personal favorites. And that starts at the very base of this food web that's here. This is the pelagic food web, or a lot of the organisms that are close to the surface of Antarctica. And it starts with phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, for how important they are and for how many organisms eat them and how beautiful they are, they really don't get some of the attention that I think that they deserve. So what are phytoplankton? Phytoplankton are just small marine organisms that use photosynthesis, just like plants on land, to produce energy. So they harvest the sun energy and carbon dioxide to produce oxygen and sugars for themselves. One very popular common group of phytoplankton in Southern Ocean are diatoms. So this left picture is a bunch of single diatoms that have all been put together into this beautiful collage. So each one of these individual shapes is an organism, and it's just mind-blowing to me, all the different shapes and sizes that they come in. And their cell walls, or their outer shell, is made from silica. So they use that silica to develop these elaborate shapes that you see on this right image here. So they're very, very tiny creatures, but they're very, very important. So diatoms, like many other phytoplankton, are performing photosynthesis, and they're producing oxygen as a byproduct, right? They're taking the sunlight and the carbon dioxide and producing oxygen and sugar. So because there's so many diatoms in the Southern Ocean and the rest of the world, that roughly 20 to 50% of the oxygen on planet Earth originated from a diatom. So when you take a big, deep breath, there's a good chance that some of that oxygen that you're breathing might have come from a diatom in Antarctica. So I think that's really unique to think about. So how do we sample phytoplankton? There's a few different tools that we use, one of which is called a CTD rosette. So CTD stands for conductivity, temperature, and density. So it's measuring those oceanic variables, but it's also collecting water. So we deploy this big machine down to different depths in the water column, and then we slowly bring it back up. And at different depth intervals, these bottles close and they trap water and everything that's living in the water inside. So then we swing this big machine onto the deck of the ship that we're working on, and a bunch of scientists run out and they start popping open the bottles and filtering to figure out what's inside the water. It kind of looks like they're milking this giant robotic cow. So this is a way that we determine how much chlorophyll is in the water, because diatoms and other phytoplankton have this chlorophyll that they use for photosynthesis. And that tells us what the general abundance of phytoplankton are at different depths. We also use satellites. So satellites have these algorithms that we can use that will tell us, based on the radiance coming from the ocean surface, what the abundance of phytoplankton are. So all these really dark red areas are where there's a lot of phytoplankton and a lot of chlorophyll. So both of these tools tell us about how much phytoplankton are in an area generally based on chlorophyll. But there's a new tool called a flow cytobot, where water samples are filtered through this tiny, tiny, powerful camera that uses a laser to take individual pictures of every single phytoplankton that goes by it. And we use artificial intelligence and graduate students to identify all those images to tell us more about the biodiversity of Antarctic phytoplankton. So are phytoplankton changing due to climate change? Short answer is yes, they are. So this is a very famous study that was done in 2009, where some scientists used satellite imagery to look and see how chlorophyll has changed since the 1950s in the Antarctic Peninsula. And this blue region up here is where chlorophyll has decreased rapidly. There's been a huge decrease in phytoplankton, and that's because of increased winds due to climate change. So the conditions there are not as optimal for phytoplankton growth. Whereas in southern parts of the Antarctic Peninsula, we've actually seen some increases in phytoplankton abundance. And this is something that we see a lot with climate change, of animals shifting their distribution because environmental conditions are changing. So we worry about all the organisms that live up there in the northern part of the peninsula, because phytoplankton are so important for feeding other organisms. They're at the base of that food web. So this decrease is very alarming. So that's phytoplankton. And we're going to move up and talk about some of the organisms that are consuming that phytoplankton, and those are zooplankton. So that includes things like krill and other species of zooplankton, and it actually includes really small fishes or larval fishes, which again is what I study. So what are zooplankton? Zooplankton is a very broad word, and it includes a vast array of different organisms, and essentially it just means usually small organisms that are freely drifting or weakly swimming near the surface of the water, but you can really find them almost anywhere in the ocean and in fresh water. So they come in all these different shapes and sizes. This is an Antarctic amphipod, which is one of my favorite zooplankton. I think they look really gnarly and predatorial, and they're voracious predators. They eat a lot of different other zooplankton, and they were actually the inspiration for one of the aliens in the James Cameron movie franchise. And there's also beautiful zooplankton. So this is an example of a pteropod swimming around in this little jar. And they're sometimes called sea angels or sea bats. And I think it's just mesmerizing the way they swim. I think they're very, very beautiful little creatures. But the two zooplankton that I would like to focus on today and talk with you about are Antarctic krill, which is pictured here, or Euphausia superba. So it looks a little bit like a shrimp, and you may or may not have heard of it. It's a pretty popular one because it's eaten by so many different organisms. And larval fishes, which again is what I study. And this is an example of a white-blooded icefish, which is really cool because they're the only vertebrate on the entire planet that doesn't have hemoglobin in its blood. So that's a molecule that gives blood its red color that's used for transporting oxygen. So these white-blooded icefishes have really unique, cool adaptations that allow them to live in the Southern Ocean. So how do we sample zooplankton? It's a little more simple than phytoplankton usually, where we just have really big nets. And we send the nets down to various depths. This one we're sending down to about 300 feet or about 120 meters. And we slowly bring the net back up. And there's something on the end called a cod end that captures all the zooplankton. And we unscrew that when it gets on deck. And we pour it into a big aquarium. And then we spend hours and hours sorting through the zooplankton and identifying things and counting things. And on this big rocking ship, you know, that video I just showed you in the Drake Passage, this can be a really challenging task. But it's very, very rewarding because, again, you never know what you're going to catch. There's so many different components of zooplankton biodiversity. It's a very interesting group of organisms to study. So how are zooplankton changing due to climate change? So first, we're going to talk about krill. How are krill changing? So this is a unique study that was done in 2019 that looked at the distribution of krill. So this blue line on the top of this figure is where the mean latitude for the krill distribution was. So that's where the center of the krill distribution was found from the 1970s to the 1990s. And then from the 1990s to the 2020s, we see this shift, right? You see how the blue line has shifted south toward the peninsula. So what's happening here is the distribution of krill in this part of the Southern Ocean is contracting closer to the continent of Antarctica. And they're doing that because they're looking for their colder conditions, for the sea ice, for what they're used to. And that's changing because of climate change. So this, again, is something that we see all over the world of animals shifting their ranges as a response to a changing environment. And this is really important because krill are a food source for so many different organisms. So this is a humpback whale in Antarctica. And what it's doing here is bubble net feeding. So they swim underneath a big swarm of this Antarctic krill, and they blow up a bunch of bubbles with their blowhole to try and disorient the krill, we think. And then they'll swim up through the swarm and open their mouths big and wide, and they'll consume all these thousands of tiny little shrimp-like creatures. And with this type of feeding, they can consume up to 2 to 3 tons of krill a day. So are fishes changing? Yes, they are changing as well. And this is an example of an Antarctic silverfish, or Pleurogramma antarctica, that I work on. It's pictured up here. It's kind of looks like a sardine. And they're really unique because they're the only Antarctic fish that lays their eggs in sea ice. So I just told you at the beginning of the talk that there's about 90 days less of sea ice coverage. So most of you can probably guess that this is negatively impacting the amount of silverfish that we see in this area. So we put together this schematic. There's a lot going on, but I'll walk you through it really quickly here, where this is supposed to be ideal conditions for silverfish spawning. So you'll have silverfish laying their eggs under the sea ice, and the larvae will hatch into water conditions that are favorable, so nice and cool, and the wind is ideal for growing sea ice, and we have happy silverfish. However, with climate change, we're seeing the opposite occurring, where there's less sea ice during the spawning period, so there's reduced spawning habitat, and the ocean is warming, so there's unfavorable conditions for the larvae. So we're very worried about this and about how silverfish are going to do in the Western Antarctic Peninsula in the future. And one of the reasons why we're worried about this is silverfish are one of the primary prey items for penguins, for several different species of penguins. So pictured here is a gentoo penguin feeding a chick, and silverfish sometimes can make up the primary diet component for these penguins. So it's very important to figure out how they might be changing. And this brings us to the next aspect of biodiversity that I'm going to talk about with you guys, which are Antarctic penguins. So I know this is everyone's favorite. We encounter 3 different species of penguins in this part of Antarctica. The first of which is an Adelie penguin, which is pictured here. This is a juvenile Adelie penguin, so it has this little tuft of fur on its head that's left over from when it was a chick. It's the last spot that it can reach. So they have these really adorable little hairdos that'll eventually go away. But for now, it's a penguin with a mohawk. There's also the gentoo penguins, which are my personal favorite. I think they're very pretty. They're also the fastest penguin swimming speed. And there's chinstrap penguins too, which are really cool looking. They have this black line that runs under their head. And I love this picture because it highlights the crazy places that you can find penguins. So it looks like they're just chilling on a snowbank, but they're actually on top of this massive iceberg. So it makes you wonder how such an awkward animal was able to waddle all the way up to the top of this jagged iceberg. How do we sample penguins? Well, one of the things that scientists do is they count the amount of breeding pairs. So this is the adult male and females that are around a nest. And this is actually really challenging because often these penguins are moving around, right? So you have this one person trying to count individual penguins as they're all moving. This is a hard job. And scientists will also weigh the chicks to determine how they grow through a season. One of the less glamorous jobs about penguin science are diet analyses. So this is penguin throw up pictured here. And scientists go through this throw up and they count all the individual krill. That's what all of these little shrimp-like creatures are in here, are krill that a single penguin has consumed. So you can imagine just how horrible this smells. And this is probably the least favorite job of a lot of scientists. And there's this new technique that's been developing. There's scientists are using GPS tags to monitor how penguins are hunting and where they swim, and kind of how they target different prey items. So are penguins changing? You might be able to guess at this point. Yes, they are. This is a very famous example of how climate change is impacting this part of Antarctica. And what's happening on this graph is we have penguin breeding pairs on the y-axis. So that's, again, the male and the female in a nest. And then we have year on the x-axis. And you can see that this one species of penguin has declined rapidly. It's declined by almost 90% since the 1970s. And that's the Adelie penguin, those ones with the cool hairdos. Meanwhile, the gentoo penguin has actually been increasing a little bit in abundance. And this is another great example for climate change, is a climate winner and a climate loser. So Adelie penguins need sea ice for their life history. They use the sea ice as kind of a staging area when they're hunting. Whereas gentoo penguins are less reliant on that sea ice. So because there's less sea ice, there's less Adelie penguins, and the gentoo penguins are kind of taking some of that habitat. So again, this is a climate change winner and a climate change loser. Okay, so last example of Antarctic biodiversity that I wanted to talk with you about today is one of my favorites, and it's actually not marine at all. It's terrestrial. It's an Antarctic midge. So what is an Antarctic midge? It's the lion of Antarctica. So this is Belgica antarctica pictured here on this person's finger. And despite its small size, this is the largest purely terrestrial organism that lives on the continent of Antarctica. which is why it's earned the name the Lion of Antarctica. It's the largest predator on the continent. So it's really cool. They have this unique life history. They have all these cool adaptations that allow them to live in the frozen continent. The adults will lay antifreeze jelly with their eggs to keep the eggs from freezing during harsh Antarctic winters. They're very, very cool little creatures. How do you sample Antarctic midges? Well, scientists will go from islands to island looking for moss, because that's often where you find these little creatures are living and eating inside the moss. And they'll use these little suction tubes to pick out the midges one by one from the moss. So another reason why I wanted to highlight the Antarctic midge with you is they demonstrate one of the few examples so far of an invasive species in Antarctica. So Belgica antarctica lives in the continent, and it's a native species. It's been there for quite some time, but there's a new species of midge that has recently been introduced to the South Orkney Islands, which is what I've highlighted in this red box. They were introduced in the 1960s by scientists, ironically. Scientists that didn't wash their equipment very well. So these invasive midges have been growing pretty rapidly, and they're eating a lot of the moss on these islands, and they're actually pooping so much that they're changing the chemistry of the earth. And scientists are really worried about how they're going to impact this environment. And this is a great example of why scientists need to be really careful when we're working in such a pristine place like Antarctica, and tourists as well. So we're having an increasing flux of tourists coming to Antarctica on cruise ships. And it's really, really important that everyone washes their gear and takes good care of the environment, because one tiny little midge can entirely change an ecosystem. So to conclude, Antarctica is home to thousands of these incredibly unique organisms. And many of them are potentially at risk from climate change and also from human travel from scientists to also from tourists. And I hope that I've highlighted today that science is a very important tool that we have to understand and protect a lot of this biodiversity, most of which you can only find in this one place in Antarctica. So with that, I would love if anyone has any questions. I'd love to chat, and if we don't get to any, I'm more than happy to answer your questions with my email, which is up here.
Awesome. It's really nice when people share their emails. So if you do have more after this broadcast, please do share with Andrew. But yes, actually, it's funny. Your next slide that was coming up there was one of my first questions. We do have a little bit of time for them. First of all, thank you so much for an awesome presentation, Andrew. That really had it all. We had the creature from Alien. We had a Mr. T haircut on the penguin. We had a flow cytobot, which is the most scientific of all the tools we featured in 24 hours. So thank you for that. And what a special place and what a special opportunity to study these sorts of creatures. And I'm really curious, for you personally, what is it like to get to go to this amazing place and to see these things, you know, firsthand? What a cool thing.
Right. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take home the most impressive piece of scientific equipment so far. my colleagues. But yeah, the first time I went to Antarctica, I was actually an intern. I went when I was 20 years old, and it just entirely blew my mind. And, you know, despite all the unique biodiversity, I think one of my personal favorite things are the icebergs, right? Where it's really hard in pictures to kind of communicate to people just how vast some of these icebergs are. And it really humbles you driving by them on like a small ship or something. And a lot of them almost resemble jewels. Well, or they've been weathered from the ocean for so long that they're these beautiful iridescent colors. So yeah, it's a crazy place to work. I would definitely encourage people to try to get into the field if they can.
Through this festival and through my general work with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we get the pleasure and privilege of getting to work with people who go to Antarctica. The two things they most mention is the scale of the landscape and the colors. And it's really quite indescribable and not something that you can truly capture in pictures. So I'm so glad to continue that trend with you. You talked about plankton, which is something that is a little bit lower down the food chain than a lot of the species that we've been featuring so far in the festival. And so with charismatic megafauna, there are lots of solutions that people can do to help protect these creatures. They can, help with tourism. They can prevent poaching. This isn't really the case for plankton. So is it the fact that I guess the only thing that humans can really do is to help mitigate climate change, this biggest issue of our time? If that's the principal impact on these plankton populations, or are there other solutions that someone at home might be able to do right now?
That's a great question, Jesse. And you know, when people ask me about what they can do, my very first thing that I like to bring up is voting. So, you know, no matter your political affiliation, it's just being an informed voter and then trying to pick a candidate that's going to care about these issues and climate change is an important first step. But when it comes to phytoplankton, something that a lot of people can do that doesn't really have an impact on Antarctic phytoplankton necessarily, but phytoplankton close to a lot of coastlines around the world, is reducing your nutrient runoff. So that's an issue that we have where you have a lot of nutrients running off from people's lawns, like fertilizers, and they encourage really harmful phytoplankton to grow and suck up a lot of the oxygen from environments. So that's something that we try and help with people where I work in Virginia, is trying to plant things on their borders to prevent that runoff and to also reduce the amount of fertilizers that they're using.
I'm really, really glad you brought that up. We had Poppy Borboroglu on earlier, and he talked about the fact that choosing what you buy carefully is one of the most essential things that we can do as citizens of the globe to help protect habitats, ecosystems, mitigate climate change, plastic pollution, and more. And so I think a lot of our audience in the United States and Mexico will know about some of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico from exactly that, the major nutrient runoff that ends up there from human activities. And so we can all play a part with that, whether it's our garden, whether it's the food we buy from grocery stores and the farms and their practices. So a neat message and sort of an unexpected take on our Antarctic program today, Andrew, so thank you for that. Time flies and you're having fun. Before we wrap up, is there any last message? If someone wanted to find out more about Antarctica, they wanted to dive in and learn about this special place, where would you send them to other than your email address?
So the program that I mentioned, the Palmer LTER, we have our own website, so you can go and learn about some of the science that people are doing down there. There's also a magazine called the Antarctic Sun that highlights a lot of the unique Antarctic research that's going on. And at least for United States citizens, the National Science Foundation does a good job highlighting stuff on their Facebook page if you want to follow that, or on Twitter. But yeah, just kind of scoping around online. There's always some Antarctic stuff in the news. Unfortunately, a lot of it's apocalyptic these days with the giant icebergs breaking off, but there's some more positive Antarctic news as well.
We saw the news of that iceberg the other day. It's quite the shift. You mentioned some great resources. I want to highlight too. It was on my bookshelf behind me. South, the Endurance Expedition. Some of the best travel and adventure and expedition writing of all time has been done about Antarctica, and it was my introduction to it as a young man. And I think it's a really special opportunity to read from some of the people, you know, both modern and in the past, that did some pretty epic expeditions there. So thanks, Andrew, for sharing such neat stuff with us today. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you guys, and thank you for having me. This is a great festival.
Awesome. Well, you're basically our 24-hour cutoff person, so you are our first official day wrapping up. So thank you so much for joining us, and keep up the amazing work, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Have a good night.
Awesome. You too.